Clara's stepmother laughed when she inherited only the puppy. The sound was sharp, cruel, echoing through the cold library like breaking glass. Clara clutched the small terrier tighter, feeling her world collapse into this single, humiliating moment. Then the door opened. Alexander Vance, the Duke of Greymore, stepped into the room. His winter-gray eyes swept past the smirking Baroness, past the sneering relatives, and landed on the trembling dog in Clara's arms. "That animal," he said, his voice cutting through the Baroness's laughter like a blade through silk, "is the last living descendant of the Greymore hunting line. By the Charter of 1672, the dog and its current guardian fall under the protection of my estate." His gaze finally met Clara's. "Miss Harrington belongs to me now." The room fell into stunned silence. But what does this ancient claim truly mean? Is Clara being rescued, or simply transferred from one cage to another? And why does the formidable Duke of Greymore care so desperately about one scruffy little dog? My beautiful family, I'd love a like or subscribe. It helps me bring you more tales of second chances and unexpected love. Let me know in the comments. Team Duke or Team Puppy? The fire in the library had been allowed to die. Clara Harrington sat rigidly on a straight-backed chair that had been positioned, deliberately, she suspected, at the furthest edge of the room from the meager warmth of the hearth. Her hands rested in her lap, fingers interlaced to stop their trembling. Beneath her chair, hidden in the shadows of her skirts, her father's small terrier, Pip, pressed against her ankles. The dog's warmth was the only comfort she had. Across the room, Baroness Vivian Albright reclined on the blue velvet settee, like a portrait of satisfied conquest. Her traveling dress was new, commissioned from London the moment Clara's father had taken to his deathbed, in a deep plum that skimmed the edge of mourning propriety without quite crossing into it. Her jewelry caught what little gray November light filtered through the windows. Garnets at her throat, jet and gold combs in her elaborately styled hair. Vivian's daughter, Lucinda, sat beside her in a matching ensemble, though her gown was cut in the more fashionable style. Everything about them was coordinated, polished, expensive. Clara looked down at her own dress, 5 years old, originally black for a distant aunt's funeral, now faded to a tired charcoal gray. The seams at the waist showed where it had been let out twice, small puckers in the fabric that no amount of pressing could smooth. The style was hopelessly outdated. Too high a waist, sleeves too narrow at the shoulder. The November rain had not stopped for 3 days. It drummed against the tall library windows with monotonous persistence, turning the grounds of Harrington Hall into a watercolor blur of gray and brown. 3 days since they had buried her father in the family plot. 3 days of this suffocating atmosphere, of Vivian's barely concealed triumph, of watching the servants quietly transfer their loyalty to the new mistress of the house. Mr. Pemberton cleared his throat and adjusted his spectacles. The parchment crackled as he unfolded it, the sound unnaturally loud in the oppressive silence. "The last will and testament of Harold Edward Harrington, Esquire," he began, his voice carefully neutral. "Being of sound mind and body on this 14th day of August, 1837. Clara's fingernails dug into her palms. Beneath her chair, Pip shifted, sensing her tension. The legal language washed over her in waves, whereas, and heretofore, and in consideration of, until Mr. Pemberton's voice sharpened with clarity. "To my beloved wife, Vivian Margaret Albright Harrington, I bequeath Harrington Hall and its contents in their entirety, along with the full sum of my invested capital, that she may live in the comfort and security befitting her station." Vivian's smile was a razor wrapped in silk. "How generous Harold was," she murmured, though her tone suggested she had expected nothing less. Mr. Pemberton continued, his eyes not quite meeting Clara's. To Miss Lucinda Albright, my stepdaughter, I leave the sum of £3,000 as a marriage portion, to be held in trust until her wedding day or her 25th birthday, whichever should come first. Lucinda's expression remained carefully composed, but Clara saw the flash of satisfaction in her eyes. The solicitor paused. The pause stretched too long. Clara's heart began to beat in slow, painful thuds. And to my daughter, Miss Clara Harrington. Mr. Pemberton's voice softened almost imperceptibly. I leave one small terrier, currently answering to the name of Pip, that she might have some companionship in the years ahead. The words hung in the air like smoke. Clara felt the blood drain from her face. She sat perfectly still, her hands frozen in her lap, while the full weight of her father's final judgment settled over her shoulders. One small dog. That was the sum of her value. The measure of 22 years of dutiful silence, of making herself small and unobtrusive, of hoping that if she could just be good enough, quiet enough, undemanding enough, he might finally see her. He had seen her, and this was his verdict. The laughter started as a small sound, almost delicate before it bloomed into something sharp and cutting. Vivian pressed a gloved hand to her mouth, but the laughter spilled through her fingers like poison. A dog, the Baroness gasped between peals of mirth. He left her a dog. She turned to Lucinda, her eyes bright with malicious delight. Not a penny, not a trinket, not even a piece of furniture. A scruffy little mongrel that eats more than it's worth. Lucinda's lips twitched with suppressed amusement. Even Mr. Pemberton looked acutely uncomfortable, his gaze fixed on the document in his hands. Clara bent slowly and gathered Pip into her arms. The little terrier licked her chin, his tail wagging uncertainly, and she buried her face in his rough fur for just a moment, letting him shield her from their stares. When she looked up again, her expression was carefully blank. If that concludes the reading, she said quietly, her voice steady despite the tremor she felt in her chest, I'll take my leave. She stood, clutching Pip against her shoulder. The dog was small but solid, his heartbeat a rapid flutter against her collarbone. He was all she had now, all she had ever really had. Vivian's laughter followed her toward the door. I'll give you until tomorrow morning to pack your things, Clara. I'm sure you'll find a suitable position somewhere. Perhaps as a governess, if anyone will overlook your lack of references. Or a companion to some elderly widow who won't mind. The library door opened. The hinges made no sound. The door was too well maintained for that. But the sudden draft from the hallway sent the dying embers in the fireplace into a brief, startled glow. Rain-scented air swept into the room, cold and clean. Alexander Vance, the Duke of Greymore, stepped across the threshold. Clara had never seen him before, but there was no mistaking who he was. He wore a black greatcoat that fell to his boots, still beaded with rain, and his dark hair was damp at the temples. His face was all sharp angles and aristocratic severity, the kind of face that appeared on marble busts in country houses. But it was his eyes that made her breath catch. Pale gray, the color of winter sky, cold and assessing, and utterly without warmth. Those eyes swept the room once, dismissing Vivian and Lucinda and Mr. Pemberton as if they were furniture. Then they locked onto the small dog in Clara's arms. The Duke went absolutely still. That animal, he said, and his voice was like frost over stone, is a Greymore terrier. No one spoke. Vivian's laughter had died in her throat. The Duke crossed the room in 3 long strides, moving with the unconscious grace of a man accustomed to command. He stopped directly in front of Clara, close enough that she could see the reins still clinging to his coat, smell the faint scent of leather and cold air. His gaze never left Pip. "This dog," he continued, reaching out one gloved hand to touch the terrier's scruffy head with surprising gentleness, "is the last living descendant of a bloodline that has been bred exclusively for the Graymore estate for 200 years. By the terms of the land charter established in 1672 between my ancestor and the Harrington family, any Graymore terrier and its guardian fall under the direct protection of the Duke." He looked at Clara then, really looked at her, and she felt the full force of that winter gray gaze. "Miss Harrington," he said quietly, "you and this dog now belong to me." Clara's mind refused to process the words. She stood frozen, holding Pip against her chest, while the Duke of Graymore studied her with those unsettling gray eyes, waiting for a response she didn't know how to give. "I beg your pardon, Your Grace," Mr. Pemberton ventured, his voice thin with uncertainty, "but I have no record of any such agreement in the Harrington family documents. Surely, if there were a binding contract—" "The charter predates your involvement with this family by approximately a century and a half," the Duke said without looking at him. "It was executed between the third Duke of Graymore and Sir Edmund Harrington in exchange for breeding rights to the original Graymore line. The terms are quite explicit. The dogs remain property of the Graymore estate in perpetuity, regardless of physical location. Their guardians are afforded full protection under ducal authority." He spoke with the casual certainty of a man who had never been questioned, never been denied. Clara felt Pip squirm in her arms, and she loosened her grip slightly, though she couldn't quite bring herself to let go. "This is absurd," Vivian said, rising from the settee with a rustle of expensive silk. "That animal is a common terrier, nothing more. Harold kept him as a pet for his daughter, because the creature was too useless even for ratting. You cannot possibly expect us to believe." "I don't expect anything from you, Lady Albright." The Duke's tone could have frozen water. "I am informing you of a legal reality. That dog descends from the Graymore line. I recognize the markings immediately. The distinctive brindling on the chest, the shape of the ears, the particular set of the jaw. There hasn't been a documented Graymore terrier outside the estate kennels in 30 years. How your late husband came to possess one is a question I intend to investigate." He turned back to Clara, and she saw something flicker in his expression. Not warmth, exactly, but perhaps a slight thaw in that Arctic composure. "Miss Harrington, I understand this is highly irregular, but the law is clear. The dog must return to Graymore Hall, and as its current guardian, you are entitled to lodging and protection on the estate for as long as you remain in that capacity." "You cannot be serious," Vivian hissed. "You would remove her from this house on the basis of some medieval contract over a dog?" "I would uphold a legally binding agreement between two noble houses, yes." The Duke's gaze slid to Vivian, and Clara saw the Baroness actually take a step back. "Unless you wish to challenge the validity of the charter in court?" "I assure you, my solicitors are considerably more expensive than yours, and they have a perfect record in such matters." The threat hung in the air like a blade. Vivian's face had gone white beneath her rouge, her mouth compressed into a thin, furious line. Clara found her voice at last. "Your Grace, I don't understand. Why would you—" She stopped, swallowed, tried again. "Surely the dog is of more value than its guardian. If you wish to take Pip, I won't stand in your way. There's no need to—" "The terms are not negotiable, Miss Harrington." Something in his voice softened, just barely. "The charter stipulates that Graymore terriers must remain with their bonded guardian. Separating them causes the dogs considerable distress and has historically led to unfortunate outcomes. I have no intention of traumatizing the animal by removing him from the only person he trusts. Pip chose that moment to lick Clara's chin, his tail wagging against her arm. Despite everything, the shock, the confusion, the surreal nightmare of the past 10 minutes, she felt a small, fragile warmth bloom in her chest, even now, even in this. Someone thought she mattered. Even if that someone was only a dog. And a duke who apparently valued the dog's emotional well-being more than social convention. "I have a carriage waiting," the duke continued. "If you require time to gather your belongings, I can return in 1 hour. I would prefer to depart before nightfall, as the roads are increasingly difficult." "She has no belongings worth gathering," Vivian snapped. "A few threadbare dresses and some books, nothing more. She's welcome to them. In fact, I insist she take them immediately." Clara flinched at the venom in the Baroness's voice, but she kept her gaze on the Duke. He was watching her carefully, she realized. Not the way men usually looked at women, not assessing her face or figure or prospects, but truly watching, as if trying to read some answer in her expression. "Miss Harrington," he said quietly, "I am offering you a choice. You may come with me to Greymore Hall, where you will be provided with comfortable lodging, appropriate clothing, and a position of respect as the guardian of a valuable animal. Or you may refuse, relinquish the dog to my care, and make your own arrangements. I will not force you." "Won't you?" Clara thought. But she looked down at Pip, at his bright eyes and scruffy face, and knew that wasn't true. The Duke understood exactly what he was doing. He knew she would never abandon the only creature in the world who loved her. "If I come with you," she said slowly, "what would be expected of me?" "To care for the dog, to allow my kennel master to assess his health and lineage, to reside at Greymore Hall as a member of the household, with all the privileges and protections that entails." He paused. "You would not be a servant, Miss Harrington. You would be a guest indefinitely under my direct protection." Behind him, Vivian made a sound of pure outrage. Clara ignored her. "And if I wished to leave? Eventually?" "The choice would be yours, provided appropriate arrangements were made for the dog's continued care." His expression remained unreadable. "I am not in the habit of imprisoning young women, whatever Lady Albright's imagination may suggest." Clara looked around the library, at the cold fireplace, at Vivian's furious face, at Mr. Pemberton's obvious discomfort. She thought of the tiny room she occupied in the servants' wing, of 6 years of careful invisibility, of the future stretching before her, a position as governess or companion, if she was lucky. Slow erasure, if she wasn't. She thought of her father's final gift, one small dog. Perhaps it was enough after all. "I'll need 20 minutes to pack," she said. The Duke's mouth curved in something that might have been approval. "I'll wait in the entrance hall." He turned and strode from the room without another word, leaving Clara standing in the wreckage of her old life, holding a scruffy terrier and a future she couldn't begin to imagine. Vivian's voice was acid. "You'll regret this, Clara. Men like him don't extend charity without expecting something in return. Mark my words, you're trading one cage for another, and this one will be far less pleasant than anything you've known here." Clara met the Baroness's eyes for the first time in 6 years without flinching. "Perhaps," she said quietly, "but at least it will be a cage of my own choosing." She walked toward the door, Pip warm and solid in her arms, and didn't look back. The Duke's carriage was the finest thing Clara had ever seen, all gleaming black lacquer and brass fittings, with the Graymore crest emblazoned on the door in silver and blue. A liveried footman helped her inside while another secured her single battered trunk to the back. The interior smelled of leather and beeswax, and the seats were upholstered in midnight blue velvet so soft it felt sinful to touch. Clara settled into the forward-facing seat, Pip on her lap, and tried not to think about how thoroughly her life had transformed in less than an hour. The Duke entered a moment later, folding his tall frame into the opposite seat with practiced ease. He rapped twice on the ceiling, and the carriage lurched into motion. Rain streamed down the windows, turning Harrington Hall into a blur of gray stone, and then nothing at all. For several minutes, neither of them spoke. Clara kept her gaze fixed on the rain-soaked countryside, acutely aware of the Duke's presence across from her. He had removed his gloves and was leafing through a small leather-bound book, apparently content to ignore her entirely. Pip, however, had no such reservations. The little terrier squirmed in Clara's lap, his attention fixed on the Duke with unmistakable interest. Before she could stop him, he launched himself across the carriage with a cheerful yap. "Pip, no!" Clara reached for him, horrified. But the Duke had already caught the dog with surprising gentleness. "It's quite all right," he said, though his voice remained coolly formal. He held Pip at eye level, studying him with an intensity that seemed excessive for such a small creature. "Hello, little one." "Yes, I see you. Energetic, aren't you?" Pip licked the Duke's nose. Clara waited for irritation, for disgust, for the kind of fastidious recoil she had seen from countless visitors to Harrington Hall when Pip had attempted similar greetings. Instead, the Duke's expression softened almost imperceptibly. He settled the terrier on his lap and ran one hand down Pip's back with the careful precision of someone assessing livestock. "Good bone structure," he murmured, more to himself than to Clara. "Proper depth of chest. The coat is rough, but that's correct for the line. And the brindling here," he touched the distinctive markings on Pip's chest. "That's unmistakable. He's genuine." "You truly believe he's from your estate's bloodline?" Clara ventured. The Duke's gray eyes met hers, and she felt pinned by that gaze like a butterfly on a collector's board. "I don't believe, Miss Harrington, I know. I've been studying the Graymore line since I was a boy. Every dog bred on the estate is documented, their lineage traced back 6 generations. This terrier," he paused, his hand stilling on Pip's head. "This dog should not exist outside Graymore Hall. The last breeding pair was sold 30 years ago, against my father's wishes, and we were told the line had died out. If Pip is genuine, and I'm certain he is, then somewhere there's been a continuation we knew nothing about." There was something in his voice, not quite anger, but a kind of controlled intensity that made Clara sit up straighter. "My father never mentioned where Pip came from," she said carefully. "He simply appeared one day, about 2 years ago. Father said he was a gift from an old friend, but he never said who." "I intend to find out." The Duke's jaw tightened. "The Graymore line is not merely a hobby, Miss Harrington. These dogs were bred for a specific purpose: intelligence, loyalty, and an almost uncanny ability to navigate the moorlands in all weather. They saved lives during the hardest winters, guided lost travelers, protected the estate. Losing the line was—" He stopped abruptly, as if realizing he had said too much. Clara watched him in silence. His hand had returned to stroking Pip's head, the gesture almost unconscious, almost tender, but there was something desperate in it too, something that didn't quite match his cold formality. "Your Grace," she said quietly, "may I ask what will happen when we arrive at Graymore Hall?" The Duke seemed to shake himself free of whatever memories had gripped him. He gently transferred Pip back to Clara's lap, and she noted how carefully he ensured the dog was settled before releasing him. "You will be given a suite in the East Wing," he said, his tone once again perfectly neutral. "It overlooks the gardens and receives excellent morning light. My housekeeper, Mrs. Daventry, will see to your needs, clothing, meals, anything you require. You will have complete freedom of the house and grounds." "That's very generous." "It's appropriate to your position." He reached into his coat and withdrew a folded document. "I had my solicitor draw this up during the journey from London. It outlines the terms of your residence at Graymore Hall." Clara took the paper with trembling fingers and unfolded it. The legal language was dense, but the essential points were clear. She would reside at Graymore Hall as the official guardian of the terrier, currently known as Pip. She would receive an annual allowance of £200 for personal expenses. She would be provided with appropriate clothing, lodging, and the full protection of the Duke's household. She could terminate the arrangement at any time, provided she gave 3 months' notice and agreed to transfer guardianship of the dog to the Duke's kennel master. £200? Clara looked up, stunned. "Your Grace, that's far too much." "It's a reasonable sum for someone in your position." His expression remained unreadable. "You are not a servant, Miss Harrington. You are the guardian of a valuable animal, residing in my household as a guest. The allowance reflects that status." "But I'm not." She struggled to find words. "I'm nobody. The daughter of a country gentleman, left with nothing but a dog. You don't owe me. I owe you nothing," the Duke agreed, and his voice was like ice over stone. "But I owe that dog everything, and you are necessary to his well-being. Those are the facts of the situation." Clara flinched at the bluntness of it. Necessary? Not welcome, not valued. Necessary, like a piece of equipment required for a specific task. The Duke must have seen something in her expression because his tone softened fractionally. "Miss Harrington, I want to be very clear about the nature of this arrangement. You are at Graymore Hall because the dog needs you. That is the beginning and end of our connection. I am not offering you charity out of pity, nor am I entertaining any romantic notions that young women in novels might imagine in such circumstances." Heat flooded Clara's cheeks. "Your Grace, I would never presume." "I'm simply establishing boundaries," he continued as if she hadn't spoken. "You will be treated with respect and courtesy. You will want for nothing. But our relationship is purely professional. I am providing you with protection and resources so that the dog receives proper care. When the time comes that other arrangements can be made, we will make them. Do you understand?" Clara looked down at Pip, who had fallen asleep in her lap, his small body rising and falling with each breath. The Duke's words should have stung, should have felt like another rejection, another confirmation of her worthlessness. But somehow they didn't. There was something almost desperate in the way he delivered them, as if he were trying to convince himself as much as her. "I understand, Your Grace," she said quietly. "You've made yourself perfectly clear." "Good." He returned his attention to his book, the conversation apparently concluded. But Clara couldn't help noticing the way his gaze kept drifting back to Pip. Couldn't miss the tension in his shoulders, the white-knuckled grip on the book he wasn't really reading. Whatever had happened to make the Duke of Graymore care so desperately about one small dog, it had marked him deeply. And Clara, whether he liked it or not, was now part of that story. Graymore Hall rose from the mist like something out of a Gothic novel, all gray stone and mullioned windows, with towers that disappeared into the low-hanging clouds. The estate sprawled across the moorlands in defiant grandeur, surrounded by ancient oaks and formal gardens that even the November rain couldn't diminish. Clara pressed her face to the carriage window, her breath fogging the glass, and felt something catch in her chest. It looked like a home. Mrs. Daventry was waiting in the entrance hall when they arrived, a tall woman with iron-gray hair and kind eyes that assessed Clara in one swift, comprehensive glance. She curtsied to the Duke, then turned to Clara with a warm smile that seemed entirely genuine. "Miss Harrington, welcome to Graymore Hall. I'm Mrs. Daventry, the housekeeper. If you'll follow me, I'll show you to your rooms." She looked down at Pip, who was shaking rain from his coat with enthusiastic vigor. "And you must be the famous terrier. My goodness, aren't you a handsome fellow?" Pip wagged his entire body in response. The Duke cleared his throat. "Mrs. Daventry, Miss Harrington is to be given every courtesy. The blue suite in the east wing, I think. And please have Ellen attend to her wardrobe requirements immediately. Miss Harrington will need a complete ensemble suitable for a guest of the house." "Of course, Your Grace." Mrs. Daventry's eyes held a flicker of curiosity, but her expression remained perfectly neutral. "I'll see to it personally." The Duke nodded once, then turned to Clara. "I trust you'll find everything satisfactory. If you have any needs, Mrs. Daventry will address them. Dinner is served at 7. I'll send word if I require Pip for examination." He strode away before Clara could respond, his boots echoing on the marble floor. Mrs. Daventry watched him go, then turned back to Clara with a softer expression. "Don't mind His Grace's manner, dear. He's not unkind, just particular. Now, let's get you settled. You must be exhausted." The blue suite was more beautiful than any room Clara had ever occupied. The sitting room had tall windows overlooking the gardens, walls papered in delicate silver and blue, and furniture that looked both expensive and comfortable. The bedroom beyond held a 4-poster bed with curtains in deep sapphire, a writing desk, and a wardrobe that could have held 10 times the clothing Clara owned. "The bathing room is through there," Mrs. Daventry said, indicating a door Clara had assumed was a closet. "We have modern plumbing installed just last year. His Grace is very particular about comfort. I'll have hot water sent up immediately, and Ellen will be along shortly to measure you for new dresses." Clara stood in the center of the sitting room, Pip exploring the space with his nose to the floor, and felt tears prick her eyes. "Mrs. Daventry, this is too much. I'm only here because of the dog." "You're here because His Grace wants you here," the housekeeper said firmly. "That's all that matters in this house. Now, I'll leave you to rest. Ring if you need anything." When the door closed behind her, Clara sank onto the settee and finally let herself cry. They were not tears of sadness, exactly, but of overwhelming relief. For the first time in 6 years, she was in a place where she wasn't merely tolerated, where someone had looked at her and seen a person worthy of care, even if that someone only cared because of a dog. Pip bounded onto the settee beside her and licked her tears away with single-minded determination. Clara laughed through her crying and pulled him into her lap. "What have you gotten us into, you ridiculous creature?" she whispered. Over the next few days, Clara began to understand the rhythm of Graymore Hall. The household ran with quiet efficiency, the servants were unfailingly courteous, and no one treated her like an unwanted burden. Ellen, a cheerful young maid with quick fingers, measured her for new dresses and returned 2 days later with garments so beautiful Clara was afraid to wear them. Mrs. Daventry checked on her regularly, bringing tea and conversation, never asking prying questions but always ready to listen. The Duke, however, remained a distant figure. She saw him primarily at dinner, which they took in a small dining room far more intimate than the grand hall the estate surely possessed. He was unfailingly polite, asking after her comfort and Pip's adjustment. But the conversations never strayed beyond the superficial. He rarely smiled. He never touched his food until she had begun eating, a courtesy she found both charming and sad. But she noticed things. She noticed how his gaze followed Pip whenever the terrier was in the room, a mixture of longing and fear in those winter-gray eyes. She noticed how he always kept a piece of chicken from his plate to give the dog, though he pretended not to. She noticed the way his shoulders relaxed fractionally when Pip bounded up to greet him, tail wagging. And Pip, for his part, seemed determined to bridge the gap between them. The terrier had no concept of ducal dignity or professional boundaries. He would steal the Duke's gloves and bring them to Clara as trophies. He would fall asleep across both their feet during dinner, forcing them to coordinate their movements. He would chase imaginary rabbits through the drawing room during their evening tea, providing distraction and inadvertent comedy in equal measure. One evening, a week after Clara's arrival, Pip managed to steal a leather bookmark from the Duke's novel and present it to Clara with obvious pride. "Pip, no!" Clara lunged for the bookmark, horrified. "Your Grace, I'm so sorry, he's never—" But the Duke was laughing. It was a startled sound, rusty from disuse, but unmistakably genuine. He looked at Pip, who was wagging his tail with unrepentant joy, and shook his head. "He's a thief," the Duke said, but there was warmth in his voice. "An absolute menace. Look at him. He's not even ashamed." "He's terrible," Clara agreed, though she was smiling. "Yesterday he stole one of Mrs. Daventry's tea cakes right off the tray." "Did he?" The Duke's expression softened. "What did Mrs. Daventry say?" She laughed and gave him another one. "He has the entire household wrapped around his paw, doesn't he?" "Completely." The Duke reached down, and Pip immediately trotted over to him, the bookmark forgotten. Alexander ran his hand over the dog's head with that same careful gentleness Clara had noticed in the carriage. "You're good with him," he said quietly, not looking at Clara. "Patient, kind. He trusts you completely." "He's easy to love," Clara said simply. The Duke's hand stilled. For a long moment he said nothing, just stared at Pip with an expression Clara couldn't quite read. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough. "Not everything that's easy to love stays." He stood abruptly, dislodging Pip. "Excuse me. I have correspondence to attend to." He left before Clara could respond, and she was left alone in the drawing room, Pip looking after him with confused eyes. That night, unable to sleep, Clara wandered down to the library. She found the Duke there, sitting in a leather chair by the fire with a glass of brandy, staring at the flames. Pip, who had followed her, immediately trotted over to the Duke and placed his paws on Alexander's knee. The Duke looked down at the little dog, and Clara saw raw pain flash across his face. "You shouldn't be here," he said, but his hand was already reaching for Pip. "Neither should you," Clara said softly from the doorway. "It's past midnight." Their eyes met across the library, and something passed between them, a recognition, perhaps, of shared loneliness, of understanding what it meant to lose things, to be left with scraps and call them blessings. "He looks like Ash," the Duke said finally. "My dog, when I was a boy. Same markings, same ridiculous optimism." His voice cracked. "I couldn't save him." Clara moved closer, drawn by the grief in his voice. "What happened?" But the Duke shook his head, the shudders coming down over his expression once more. "Good night, Miss Harrington." It was a dismissal, clear and final. But as Clara left, Pip still in her arms, she heard the Duke whisper something to the empty room. "I won't fail again." The morning was unexpectedly clear, the first break in the weather since Clara's arrival at Graymore Hall. Sunlight streamed through the breakfast room windows, turning the frost-covered gardens into a field of diamonds. The Duke had left early for estate business, and Mrs. Daventry had suggested Clara might enjoy exploring the grounds with Pip while the weather held. "There's a lovely path through the West Gardens," the housekeeper had said. "It leads to the old chapel. His Grace's family is buried there, and the grounds are quite beautiful even in winter." Clara had gratefully accepted the suggestion. 2 weeks at Graymore Hall had restored some color to her cheeks and eased the permanent tension in her shoulders. But she still felt like a guest walking on eggshells, careful not to disturb the careful boundaries the Duke had established. A walk in the fresh air, away from the weight of his watchful silences, seemed like a blessing. Pip was delighted with the expedition, bounding ahead on the frost-hardened path, his breath making small clouds in the cold air. Clara followed at a more sedate pace, wrapped in a new wool cloak that Ellen had delivered just that morning. It was forest green and lined with silk, far finer than anything she had owned at Harrington Hall. The chapel was small and ancient, built of the same gray stone as the main house, with a bell tower that rose into the clear blue sky. The family cemetery spread around it in neat rows, the headstones weathered by centuries of moorland wind. Clara wandered among them, reading the names. Generations of Vances. Their inscriptions speaking of duty and honor and love. Pip had disappeared around the side of the chapel, and Clara followed the sound of his enthusiastic digging. She rounded the corner and stopped abruptly. There was a small garden here, sheltered from the wind by the chapel wall. Someone maintained it carefully. The hedges were neatly trimmed, the path cleared of weeds. In the center stood a memorial, not a traditional headstone, but a carved stone bench with a bronze plaque set into its back. Clara moved closer, her heart suddenly beating faster. The plaque bore an inscription in elegant script. "In memory of Ashford, faithful companion to Alexander Vance, 1823 to 1831. Greater love hath no man than this, gone too soon, never forgotten." Below the words was an image rendered in bronze relief, a terrier, captured in exquisite detail. The resemblance to Pip was unmistakable. The same brindled chest, the same alert ears, the same intelligent eyes. 1831. Clara did the calculation quickly. The Duke would have been 15 years old. Pip had stopped digging and was sniffing around the base of the memorial, his tail wagging slowly. Clara sank onto the bench, running her fingers over the worn bronze. The metal was smooth in places where hands had touched it repeatedly, lovingly. Someone came here often. She closed her eyes and tried to imagine it. A boy of 15, losing his faithful companion. The grief would have been terrible at any age. But adolescence made everything sharper, more devastating. She thought of the Duke's face in the library, the way he had looked at Pip and whispered I couldn't save him. "Miss Harrington?" Clara jumped, her eyes flying open. The Duke stood at the edge of the garden, still in his riding clothes, his expression carefully blank. But his eyes, those winter gray eyes, held something raw and wounded. "Your Grace, I'm so sorry," Clara stammered, standing quickly. Mrs. Daventry suggested I walk the grounds, and Pip ran ahead. "I didn't mean to intrude on—" "It's not an intrusion." He moved closer, his gaze fixed on the memorial rather than on her. The garden is open to anyone who wishes to visit. I didn't expect to find you here." Pip trotted over to the Duke and sat at his feet, looking up with worshipful eyes. Alexander stared down at the little dog, and Clara saw his jaw tighten. "He looks so much like him," the Duke said quietly. "When I first saw Pip in your arms at Harrington Hall, it was like seeing a ghost." Clara remained silent, sensing that he needed to speak more than she needed to ask. "Ash was born the same year I was," Alexander continued. "My father gave him to me when we were both 6 months old. We grew up together. He slept in my room, followed me everywhere, learned to anticipate my moods before I understood them myself. He was—" The Duke's voice caught. "He was my truest friend." "What happened?" Clara asked gently. Alexander was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was distant, as if he were seeing something far away. "We were out on the moors in winter. I was 15, convinced I was invincible. There was a storm coming, but I ignored the warnings. I wanted to reach the old hunting lodge before dark, some foolish, boyish notion of proving myself capable. Ash followed me, of course. He always followed me." He paused, his hands clenched at his sides. "The storm hit harder than anyone had predicted. We were caught in the open, in the dark, in snow so thick I couldn't see my own hands. I was terrified, completely lost. But Ash knew the way home. He tried to lead me back, pulling at my coat, barking to guide me. I was so cold, so confused. I thought he was panicking, making things worse. So I tied him to a tree to keep him from running off, thinking I could come back for him once I found shelter." Clara's breath caught. "Oh, Alexander." I collapsed half a mile away. The estate gamekeeper found me the next morning, nearly frozen to death. They brought me home, put me to bed. I was delirious with fever for 3 days. When I finally came back to myself and asked about Ash, his voice broke completely. They'd sent search parties out immediately, but the snow had covered everything. It took them 2 more days to find him. "He was still tied to the tree," Clara whispered, understanding. "Still tied to the tree," the Duke confirmed, his voice hollow. "Waiting for me, trusting that I would come back. He froze to death alone because I abandoned him, because I thought I knew better than he did." Tears streamed down Clara's cheeks. She wanted to reach for him, to offer comfort, but she knew instinctively that he would reject it. "My father had him brought back and buried here," Alexander continued. "He told me that grief was natural, but guilt was a choice, that Ash would have forgiven me, had forgiven me because that's what loyal creatures do. But He looked down at Pip, who was still sitting patiently at his feet. "I swore I would never keep another dog, never risk that kind of loss again, never be responsible for that kind of suffering." "And then Pip appeared," Clara said softly. "And then Pip appeared." The Duke finally met her eyes. "The moment I saw him, I knew I had to protect him, had to ensure nothing happened to him. The charter was convenient justification. But the truth is, I couldn't bear the thought of another Greymoor Terrier suffering because of human carelessness, even if that meant bringing a stranger into my home." Clara understood then. The rigid boundaries, the insistence that their relationship was purely transactional, the fear she'd sensed beneath his formal courtesy. He wasn't protecting himself from her. He was protecting himself from loving Pip, from risking that devastating loss again. "He loves you already," she said gently. "Pip, I mean." You must see that." "I see it," Alexander said, his voice tight. "That's what terrifies me." Pip, oblivious to the emotional weight of the moment, chose that instant to bounce forward and paw at the Duke's boot, demanding attention. Alexander looked down at the little dog, and Clara saw the war raging in his expression, longing and fear, love and self-protection. "You didn't kill Ash," Clara said quietly. "The storm killed him. You were a frightened boy who made a mistake. You're not that boy anymore." "Aren't I?" The Duke's smile was bitter. "I'm still making decisions out of fear. Still hiding behind duty and distance because it's safer than feeling." "Then perhaps," Clara said, gathering her courage, "it's time to stop hiding." Their eyes met, and something shifted between them. The Duke looked at her, really looked at her, perhaps for the first time since she'd arrived. Not as Pip's guardian, not as a necessary inconvenience, but as a person who understood loss and loneliness and the terrible weight of guilt. "I don't know how," he admitted, so quietly she almost didn't hear it. Clara knelt and scooped up Pip, then held the wriggling terrier out toward Alexander. "Start here," she said simply. For a long moment the Duke didn't move. Then slowly, he reached out and took Pip from her hands. The little dog immediately licked his face with enthusiastic affection, and Alexander closed his eyes. "Hello, Pip," he whispered. "I'm sorry I've been such a coward." And there, in the winter garden, beside a memorial to a beloved friend, the Duke of Greymore finally began to let himself love again. The London townhouse was a revelation in marble and gilt. All soaring ceilings and crystal chandeliers that caught the afternoon light and scattered it like diamonds. Clara stood in the entrance hall, Pip tucked under her arm, and tried not to look as overwhelmed as she felt. "The season is nearly over," Alexander said, removing his gloves with precise movements. "But there are still enough gatherings to accomplish what we need. Lady Pemberton is hosting a musicale tomorrow evening. It will be intimate enough to avoid overwhelming attention, but well-attended enough to establish your presence." "Establish my presence," Clara repeated carefully. "As what, exactly?" Alexander's expression was unreadable. "As my guest. Under my protection. The rest will be left deliberately vague, which will make it far more interesting to the gossips than any official explanation." 3 weeks had passed since the morning in Ash's garden. The Duke hadn't transformed overnight into a different person. He was still formal, still careful with his words. But something fundamental had shifted. He sought out Pip's company now instead of avoiding it. He occasionally smiled at the dinner table. Once, Clara had even heard him laugh at one of the terrier's more ridiculous antics. But he still maintained those rigid boundaries between himself and Clara. Still called her Miss Harrington. Still treated her with the courteous distance of a benefactor rather than what? She didn't know. Didn't dare let herself imagine. "Your Grace," she said quietly, "are you certain this is necessary? Surely Pip's lineage doesn't require social validation." "It's not about the dog's lineage." Alexander's jaw tightened. "It's about ensuring you're afforded the respect and protection you deserve. Once society sees you under my sponsorship, no one will dare treat you as—" He stopped abruptly. "As my stepmother did?" Clara finished softly. Their eyes met, and she saw something fierce flash in his expression. "Precisely. Lady Pemberton's musicale was attended by precisely the sort of people Clara had spent her life avoiding. Wealthy, titled, and possessed of that particular brand of casual cruelty that passed for wit among the ton. She wore a new gown of pale blue silk that Ellen had insisted made her eyes luminous, and she carried Pip in a specially commissioned basket lined with velvet. "Remember," Alexander murmured as they entered the drawing room, "you are my guest. That affords you considerable social armor. And if anyone makes you uncomfortable, you need only catch my eye." But it was the Duke who drew every gaze the moment they appeared. Conversations faltered and resumed in hushed whispers. Clara felt the weight of dozens of eyes assessing her, categorizing her, trying to determine what she was to the famously reclusive Duke of Greymore. "Your Grace." Lady Pemberton swept forward, a vision in purple silk and diamonds. "How delightful that you accepted my invitation. And you've brought a guest. How charming." "Lady Pemberton, may I present Miss Clara Harrington?" Alexander said with perfect formality. "She's recently taken up residence at Greymore Hall as guardian to a rather special animal." On cue, Pip poked his head out of the basket, ears alert, looking around with bright-eyed curiosity. Lady Pemberton's expression melted. "Oh, what an adorable little creature. Is he a terrier?" "A Greymore terrier," Alexander said, and there was unmistakable pride in his voice. "The last of a bloodline we believed extinct. Miss Harrington's stewardship of him has been invaluable." The words were carefully chosen, Clara realized. Not a servant, not a paid companion, a steward, someone entrusted with something precious. They were surrounded within minutes. The ladies cooed over Pip, who responded with shameless enthusiasm, charming them with tail wags and gentle paw touches. The gentlemen engaged Alexander in conversation about breeding lines and hunting dogs, but their eyes kept drifting to Clara with ill-concealed curiosity. She was managing rather well, she thought, until a familiar voice cut through the pleasant chatter. "Why, Clara Harrington, I hardly recognized you in such fine clothing. What a transformation." Clara's blood ran cold. She turned slowly to find Baroness Vivian Albright standing behind her, resplendent in black silk and garnets, her smile as sharp as cut glass. "Baroness," Clara managed, her voice barely steady, "I heard the most extraordinary rumor that you'd taken up residence with the Duke of Greymore," Vivian continued, her voice pitched to Carrie. "Over a dog, of all things. I confess, I thought it must be exaggeration. But here you are, clutching that same scruffy mongrel your father left you. How quaint." The conversations around them quieted. Clara felt heat flood her cheeks, felt the familiar crushing weight of humiliation settling over her shoulders. But then Pip squirmed in his basket, popped his head up, and sneezed directly at the Baroness. The effect was instantaneous. Several ladies giggled behind their fans. A gentleman coughed to cover a laugh. Vivian's face went rigid with fury. "The dog appears to have excellent judgment," a dry voice observed. Everyone turned. The Dowager Countess of Harwick, the most formidable social arbiter in London, was watching the scene with obvious amusement. She was ancient and terrifying, and when she spoke, society listened. "Lady Albright," the Dowager continued, "I understand you're the young lady's stepmother. How unfortunate that you seem unfamiliar with the significance of the Greymore Terrier line. These animals are quite legendary. The Duke's ancestors valued them above rubies. Rather makes one wonder about the judgment of anyone who would dismiss such a creature as a scruffy mongrel." Vivian's smile froze. "I merely meant—" "And Miss Harrington," the Dowager swept on as if Vivian hadn't spoken, "appears to have done an admirable job caring for the animal. He's clearly healthy, well socialized, and quite charming. Greymore, you chose your guardian wisely." Alexander, who had materialized at Clara's elbow, without her noticing, inclined his head. "Miss Harrington has exceeded every expectation, Lady Harwick. Pip has thrived under her care." "Pip?" The Dowager's eyes twinkled. "You've given him a pet name. How delightfully informal." "Miss Harrington named him," Alexander said, and Clara heard warmth in his voice. "I believe it suits him perfectly." As if to demonstrate, Pip chose that moment to climb out of his basket entirely and onto Clara's shoulder, where he perched like an absurd, furry parrot. The effect was so ridiculous, so unexpectedly charming, that even the Dowager laughed. "Extraordinary," she declared. "Miss Harrington, you must bring him to my card party next week. I insist upon it. A dog with such personality deserves to be shown off properly." "That's very kind, but—" Clara began. "We'd be delighted," Alexander interrupted smoothly. "Thank you, Lady Harwick." The Dowager swept away, and the crowd around them resumed their conversations with renewed energy. But now the tone had shifted. Instead of curiosity tinged with judgment, Clara heard approval, fascination, even a bit of envy. Vivian stood frozen, her social attack deflected so thoroughly she had no recourse. She opened her mouth, closed it, then turned on her heel and stalked away without another word. Clara sagged with relief, reaching up to steady Pip on her shoulder. "I thought she was going to destroy me," she whispered. "She tried," Alexander said quietly. "But you have something she'll never understand." "What's that?" He looked at her, and his expression was so gentle it made her breath catch. Genuine warmth. "People respond to authenticity, Miss Harrington. Pip adores you because you're kind. Society will adore you for the same reason." "They adore Pip," Clara corrected. "I'm simply the person holding him." "No," Alexander said firmly. "They adore you both. There's a difference." The musicale continued around them, but Clara barely heard the performance. She was too aware of Alexander standing beside her, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from him, of the way his hand occasionally brushed against hers when he reached to pet Pip, of the pride in his voice when he introduced her to yet another curious aristocrat. By the end of the evening, she had received 7 invitations, 3 compliments on her gown, and more genuine smiles than she'd experienced in her entire life at Harrington Hall. As they prepared to leave, Lady Pemberton pressed Clara's hand warmly. "You must come again, my dear, and bring that delightful dog. He's been the highlight of the evening." In the carriage ride home, Pip sprawled across both their laps, fast asleep from all the attention. Clara stroked his soft fur and tried to process everything that had happened. "You were magnificent," Alexander said quietly. Clara looked up, startled. "I barely said anything." "Precisely. You let your character speak for itself. And Pip, of course, was your perfect advocate." He smiled, a real smile that reached his eyes. "The Dowager Countess doesn't offer invitations lightly. You've been accepted, Clara. Truly accepted." It was the first time he'd used her given name. In the darkness of the carriage, with Pip warm between them and London streaming past the windows, Clara felt something shift in her chest, something dangerous and wonderful and terrifying. She was falling in love with Alexander Vance, and she had absolutely no idea what to do about it. We're about to reach the most dramatic moment of Clara's story, the confrontation with Baroness Vivian that will change everything. But I have to pause here because I need your help. Only 3 out of every 10 viewers actually like these videos, and it genuinely hurts. If you've made it this far, if you're invested in Clara finding happiness, if Pip has made you smile even once, If you're hoping the Duke finally breaks through his walls, then please show me with a like. It takes 1 second of your time, but gives me the encouragement to keep creating these stories. And if you haven't subscribed yet, what are you waiting for? Do you really want to risk forgetting about this channel and never finding out how other heroines find their happily ever afters? I create these stories because I believe we all deserve tales of hope and love. Don't let this be the last one you see. Subscribe now, turn on notifications, and be part of this community. Now, let's see what happens when Vivian makes her final, cruel move at the ball. The Marchioness of Westfield's ball was the final grand event of the London season. Held in a ballroom so magnificent, it seemed designed to make mortals feel insignificant. Crystal chandeliers the size of carriages hung from gilded ceilings, and the marble floors gleamed like still water. The cream of society swirled across the space in silks and jewels, a river of wealth and privilege. Clara stood at the edge of the ballroom in a gown of ivory silk with delicate gold embroidery, feeling distinctly out of place despite the past 3 weeks of social success. Pip was upstairs in a private room with a servant assigned specifically to his care, the Marchioness had insisted, declaring that the famous Greymore Terrier deserved proper accommodation. "You're doing it again," Alexander murmured beside her. "Doing what?" "Trying to disappear into the wallpaper." His hand found hers, warm and steady. "You belong here, Clara. Stop questioning it." She looked up at him, resplendent in black evening clothes that made his gray eyes seem even more striking. Over the past weeks, he had become less the remote Duke and more simply Alexander. Still formal in public, but allowing moments of warmth to show through. Moments like this, when he held her hand just a fraction longer than propriety required. "Dance with me," he said quietly. It wasn't a request. He led her onto the floor as a waltz began, his hand settling at her waist with possessive certainty. They had danced before at other events, but tonight felt different. Tonight, the way he looked at her made her feel like they were alone in the crowded ballroom. "Alexander," she began, then stopped, uncertain what she wanted to say. "I know," he said softly, and the tenderness in his voice made her heart stumble. They were turning past the terrace doors when Clara saw her. Baroness Vivian Albright, standing in conversation with a distinguished older gentleman Clara didn't recognize. Vivian's gaze locked onto Clara, and her smile was pure malice. "She's here," Clara whispered. Alexander's hand tightened on her waist. "I know. I've been watching her all evening. She's been speaking to Lord Whitmore. He's on the board of the Kennel Club. Nothing good will come of it." He was right. 10 minutes later, as Alexander was procuring champagne, Vivian made her move. She stepped into the center of the ballroom during a lull in the music, her voice carrying with practiced projection. "I'm afraid I must bring a most distressing matter to everyone's attention," she announced, every inch the concerned gentlewoman. "It pains me greatly, but I cannot in good conscience remain silent when fraud is being perpetrated against this company." The ballroom fell silent. Every eye turned to Vivian. Clara felt ice crystallize in her veins. "My stepdaughter," Vivian continued, gesturing toward Clara with theatrical regret, "has been representing herself as the guardian of a rare Greymore Terrier, trading on the Duke of Greymore's good name and generous nature. But I have it on excellent authority that the dog in question is nothing more than a common mongrel." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Clara stood frozen, unable to move, unable to breathe. Lord Whitmore stepped forward, looking deeply uncomfortable. "Your Grace, I must ask, Have you actually verified the animal's lineage through official channels? Lady Albright has raised serious concerns about the documentation. Documentation she couldn't possibly have seen, Alexander said, his voice cutting through the murmurs like a blade. He moved to Clara's side, his presence a wall between her and Vivian's malice. Since it remains in my private possession at Greymore Hall. Then perhaps you cannot produce it? Vivian suggested sweetly. Perhaps because it doesn't exist? I only raise the concern because my late husband acquired that dog from a traveling merchant, not from any official breeding program. The poor creature is simply a pet, nothing more. My stepdaughter, in her desperation, has concocted an elaborate fiction to secure herself a position in your Grace's household. The accusations hung in the air like poison. Clara saw doubt flicker across familiar faces, saw Lady Pemberton frown, saw the Dowager Countess of Harwick watching with narrowed eyes. You're suggesting, Alexander said, his voice dangerously quiet, that Miss Harrington is a fraud, and that I am either complicit or a fool. I would never suggest your Grace is anything but honorable, Vivian said, but her smile suggested otherwise. Merely, perhaps too trusting, too willing to be taken advantage of by a young woman with no prospects and nothing to lose. Enough. Alexander's voice cracked like a whip. You've made your accusations, Lady Albright. Now allow me to respond with facts. He withdrew a folded document from his inner coat pocket. This is the official lineage documentation for the terrier known as Pip, verified by 3 independent breed experts and certified by the Kennel Club itself. The dog is confirmed as a purebred Greymore Terrier, descended from the Ashford line through a breeding pair sold to a Mr. Thomas Hartley of Yorkshire in 1831. He handed the document to Lord Whitmore, who examined it with evident surprise. Your late husband, Alexander continued, his gaze fixed on Vivian, purchased the dog from Mr. Hartley's estate sale 2 years ago. The sale records are available for inspection. There is no fraud, no deception, and no fiction. Only fact, documented and verified. Vivian's face had gone white beneath her rouge. You cannot prove. I can prove everything, Alexander interrupted. What I cannot prove, and what deeply concerns me, is why you are so determined to ruin your stepdaughter's reputation. What has Miss Harrington done to deserve such venom? Existed, survived, found happiness after years of neglect in your household? The ballroom was utterly silent now, every eye fixed on the unfolding drama. Miss Harrington inherited nothing from her father except one small dog, Alexander said, and his voice carried to every corner of the vast room. You laughed at her for it, mocked her, turned her out with nothing but the clothes on her back and a terrier you deemed worthless. But that dog, that supposedly worthless animal, led her to safety, to dignity, to a place where her inherent worth was finally recognized. He turned to Clara, and the expression in his eyes made her breath catch. I brought Clara to Greymore Hall because of Pip, he said quietly, speaking only to her now, though the entire ballroom listened. Because I needed the dog, and she was necessary to his well-being. But I'm asking her to stay because I need her, not as a guardian or a guest or a convenient solution to a breeding problem, but as my wife, if she'll have me. The ballroom erupted in gasps and whispers. Clara felt tears spill down her cheeks. Alexander, she whispered. You don't have to. I want to, he said firmly. He took her hands, holding them in front of everyone. I've spent 17 years hiding from love because I was afraid of loss. You and Pip taught me that love is worth the risk. That some things, some people, are worth choosing. regardless of duty or logic or self-protection. He raised his voice again, addressing the crowd. Miss Clara Harrington is under my protection as my intended bride. Anyone who questions her honor answers to me. Anyone who speaks against her will find themselves unwelcome in every house I have influence over. And as for you, Lady Albright, he turned to Vivian, and his expression was arctic. You are no longer welcome in any establishment that values my patronage. Leave. Now. Vivian stood trembling with fury and humiliation. For a moment, Clara thought she might refuse, might cause an even greater scene. But the Dowager Countess of Harwick spoke up, her voice carrying absolute authority. You heard his grace. Leave. Vivian fled, her exit marked by whispers and pointed stares. The moment she disappeared, the ballroom exploded into excited chatter. But Clara barely heard it. She was staring at Alexander, trying to process what had just happened. You proposed to me, she said faintly. In front of everyone? I did. He searched her face anxiously. I realize this isn't how these things are typically done. But I couldn't let her ruin you. Couldn't let her take away what we've found together. And I needed you to know, needed everyone to know, that you're not convenient or temporary or merely tolerated. You're chosen. Deliberately, permanently chosen. Because of Pip? Clara asked, needing to hear it. Because of you, Alexander said fiercely. Pip brought you to me, yes. But I'm asking you to stay because you're kind and brave and genuine. Because you make me laugh. Because you see past the title to the man underneath. Because I love you, Clara. Completely. Terrifyingly. Irrevocably. Clara laughed through her tears. I love you too. I have for weeks. I just didn't dare. He kissed her then, right there in the middle of the Marchioness of Westfield's ballroom, in front of 300 members of the Ton. It was scandalous and improper and absolutely perfect. When they finally broke apart, the ballroom was applauding. I believe that's a yes? Alexander murmured against her hair. Yes, Clara whispered. 1,000 times yes. And somewhere upstairs, as if he knew, Pip barked joyfully. The announcement of their engagement in the Times had been met with widespread approval and only a modest amount of scandal. The Duke of Greymore, reclusive and famously unmarried at 32, had chosen a nobody with no fortune and no connections. Society found it deliciously romantic. Clara found it terrifying. They had returned to Greymore Hall to prepare for the wedding, planned for 6 weeks hence. The house hummed with activity, seamstresses measuring Clara for her trousseau, Mrs. Daventry organizing menus, the chapel being cleaned and decorated. Alexander was attentive and affectionate, stealing kisses in empty corridors, holding her hand during their evening walks with Pip. But a small, persistent voice in Clara's mind whispered that it was too good to be true, that she was still just the girl who had inherited only a dog, that Alexander's proposal had been chivalry, not love, no matter what he claimed. She hated that voice, but she couldn't silence it. The doubts crystallized into panic when Lady Genevieve Ashford arrived. She appeared without warning one afternoon, sweeping into the drawing room in a traveling dress of deep burgundy that perfectly complemented her auburn hair and porcelain complexion. She was beautiful in the effortless way of women born to wealth and privilege. And she greeted Alexander with the easy familiarity of old friendship. Alexander, darling. She kissed both his cheeks in the continental fashion. I came as soon as I heard the extraordinary news. You engaged. I had to see for myself if the rumors were true. Genevieve. Alexander's smile was polite, but reserved. I didn't know you were back in England. Just arrived from Vienna last week. The diplomatic life grew tiresome. Her gaze slid to Clara with assessing interest. And you must be the famous Miss Harrington. How delightful to meet you. Clara curtsied, feeling dowdy in her simple morning dress compared to Genevieve's elegance. Lady Ashford? Oh, we're to be friends, surely. Any woman who can capture Alexander's heart must be extraordinary. Genevieve settled onto the settee with graceful ease. Tell me everything. How did you meet? Was it terribly romantic? The afternoon passed in stilted conversation. Genevieve was charming and witty, asking questions that seemed friendly, but left Clara feeling exposed and inadequate. She spoke of shared history with Alexander, childhood summers, society events, mutual friends, painting a picture of belonging that Clara could never match. Do you remember the house party at Ashford Manor, Alexander? Genevieve asked at one point. The summer you turned 14? We were inseparable that year. Something flickered across Alexander's face. I remember. That was the summer before. Genevieve stopped abruptly, glancing at Clara. Well, ancient history. But Clara had caught the sudden tension in Alexander's shoulders, the way his hand tightened on his teacup. The summer before what? She asked quietly. Before his dog died, Genevieve said with apparent sympathy. That dreadful accident on the moors. Such a tragedy. It wasn't an accident, Alexander said, his voice tight. It was my fault. Oh, darling, you can't still blame yourself. Genevieve reached across and touched his hand. You were just a boy. How could you have known the storm would be so severe? Clara watched the easy intimacy of the gesture and felt something cold settle in her stomach. That evening, unable to sleep, Clara went downstairs for a book. She was passing the library when she heard voices, Alexander and Genevieve, speaking in low, intense tones. You shouldn't have come, Alexander was saying. I had to see you, to make sure you weren't making a terrible mistake. Genevieve's voice was urgent. Alexander, I know what you're doing. You're trying to rewrite the past, to save that boy who lost his dog, but marrying some impoverished girl because she came with a terrier. You don't know what you're talking about. Don't I? You've been alone for 17 years, turning away every woman who showed interest. Then a girl appears with a dog that looks like Ash, and suddenly you're engaged? It's not love, Alexander. It's guilt and nostalgia wrapped up in a pretty package. Clara pressed her hand to her mouth, fighting nausea. My relationship with Clara is none of your concern, Alexander said coldly. I'm trying to protect you. We were friends once, before that awful winter. Before you shut everyone out. I know you, Alexander. I know you're doing this because you think you can fix the past. But you can't bring Ash back by marrying his replacement's guardian. There was a long silence. Clara held her breath, waiting for Alexander to deny it, to defend their love. Genevieve, I think you should leave in the morning, he said finally. This conversation is inappropriate. Because I'm telling truths you don't want to hear? Because you're a guest in my home, speaking disrespectfully about my fiancé. Good night. Clara fled before she could hear more, racing up the stairs to her room with Pip at her heels. She closed the door and sank onto the bed, shaking. You can't bring Ash back by marrying his replacement's guardian. Was that what she was? A replacement? A way for Alexander to assuage his 17-year-old guilt? She thought of how he'd looked at Pip that first day in Harrington Hall's library. The intensity, the desperation. She thought of the memorial garden, of the way he'd confessed his failure with Ash. She thought of every careful boundary he'd established, every reminder that she was only at Greymore because of the dog. He had said he loved her. But had he? Or had he loved the idea of redemption she represented? Pip whined and pressed against her leg. Clara gathered him into her arms, burying her face in his fur. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I thought we'd found a home. But I think we're just ghosts filling an empty space." She made her decision in the cold hours before dawn. She would leave. Not dramatically, not with accusations or confrontations. She would simply go, quietly, taking Pip with her. Alexander could find another guardian for the Greymore line. He could find a bride who belonged in his world, who wasn't constantly haunted by the certainty that she was only tolerated, not truly wanted. She packed her old carpet bag with the few possessions that felt truly hers. Not the beautiful gowns Alexander had provided, but her worn books, her mother's locket, the simple things that had survived Vivian's contempt. Just before dawn, she wrote a letter. Her hand shook as she formed the words. "Alexander, I cannot marry you. Not because I don't love you, I do, more than I thought possible. But because I finally understand that love isn't enough when it's built on the wrong foundation. Genevieve was right. You asked me to stay because of Pip, because he looked like Ash, because you saw a chance to rewrite an old tragedy. I don't blame you for it. Grief makes us do desperate things, but I can't be your redemption. I can't spend my life wondering if you married me for myself or for the ghost of a dog you couldn't save 17 years ago. I'm taking Pip with me. I know that breaks our agreement, but I can't leave him. He's all I have. I hope you find peace with Ash's memory. I hope you find real love with someone who belongs in your world. Clara." She left the letter on his desk, gathered Pip into her arms, and slipped out through the servants' entrance as the first gray light touched the horizon. The morning was cold and damp, mist rising from the moorlands like ghosts. Clara had no clear destination, only a desperate need to escape before her courage failed. She had some money saved from her allowance, enough for a coaching in, perhaps. And then, she didn't know. She would find work somewhere. A position as a governess, if anyone would hire a woman with a dog. She had walked perhaps a mile when Pip suddenly squirmed in her arms, barking urgently back toward Greymore Hall. "Hush," Clara whispered. "We can't go back. We don't belong there." But Pip wouldn't be quieted. He wriggled free and ran back down the path, still barking, his small form quickly disappearing into the mist. "Pip!" Clara ran after him, panic rising. "Pip, come back!" She found him sitting in the middle of the path, tail wagging, looking past her with evident joy. Clara turned. Alexander stood in the mist like a figure from a dream, still in his shirt sleeves, his hair disheveled, his face stricken. "Don't," he said, his voice breaking. "Please don't leave." Clara stood frozen on the misty path, her carpet bag heavy in her hand, while Alexander approached with careful steps as if she were a wild creature that might bolt at any sudden movement. Pip danced between them, tail wagging, apparently delighted to have orchestrated this reunion. "You read my letter," Clara said, her voice barely audible. "I read your letter." Alexander stopped a few feet away, and she saw that his hands were shaking. "You're wrong, Clara, about everything." "Am I?" The words came out sharper than she intended. Genevieve said what she's always said." Alexander's jaw tightened. "That I'm broken. That I'm incapable of moving forward. that any choice I make that doesn't align with her vision of my life must be self-deception. He took a breath. She's been saying it for 17 years. I stopped listening a long time ago. But she was right about Pip, Clara insisted, needing him to understand. You saw him and you saw Ash. You said so yourself. And everything you've done, bringing me to Greymore, protecting me, even proposing, it all started because of the dog. How can I know where the guilt ends and genuine feeling begins? Alexander flinched as if she'd struck him. For a long moment he said nothing, just stood there in the dawn mist looking utterly lost. Then he sank down onto the damp ground, heedless of his fine clothes, and held out his hand to Pip. The little terrier bounded over immediately, climbing into Alexander's lap with enthusiastic affection. Alexander gathered him close, and Clara saw tears on his face. You're right, he said quietly. It did start with Pip. When I saw him in your arms at Harrington Hall, it was like being 17 again. Watching Ash freeze to death because of my arrogance and stupidity. I thought, his voice cracked, I thought if I could save this dog, protect him, ensure nothing happened to him, maybe I could finally forgive myself. Clara's throat tightened. This was what she'd feared, what Genevieve had confirmed. But then something happened that I didn't expect, Alexander continued. He looked up at her, his gray eyes raw with emotion. I started to heal. He stroked Pip's head with gentle reverence. Every day with this ridiculous, mischievous, loving creature chipped away at the wall I'd built around my heart. He didn't need me to be perfect. He didn't need me to atone for past failures. He just needed me to show up, to be present, to love him despite my fear of losing him. Pip licked Alexander's face, and the Duke actually laughed through his tears. And you, Alexander said, his gaze finding Clara's again. You showed me what it meant to love without conditions. You never asked me to be anything other than myself. You saw my scars and my guilt and my careful distance, and you didn't demand I change. You just stayed. Quietly, patiently, beautifully stayed. Alexander, let me finish. Please. He stood slowly, Pip still in his arms. Last night, after Genevieve left, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about what she'd said, wondering if she was right. Wondering if I'd deluded myself into thinking what I felt was love, when it was really just guilt wearing a prettier mask. He stepped closer, and Clara saw the exhaustion in his face, the shadows under his eyes. So I went to Ash's memorial. I sat there in the dark and tried to be honest with myself. Tried to separate what I felt for Pip from what I felt for you. Tried to determine if Genevieve was right, if I was just trying to rewrite the past. And? Clara whispered. And Pip followed me. Alexander's smile was tremulous. I didn't realize he'd left your room, but there he was in the garden, refusing to leave my side. I tried to send him back to you. It was cold, and I didn't want him to catch a chill. But he wouldn't go. Alexander's voice grew thick with emotion. He stayed with me for hours, Clara. Just sat there, pressed against my leg, keeping me company while I grieved. And I realized, this is what Ash would have wanted. Not for me to spend 17 years punishing myself. Not for me to build walls so high that nothing could touch me. He would have wanted me to love again. To trust again. To let myself be happy. He transferred Pip to one arm and reached for Clara's hand with the other. She let him take it, feeling the warmth of his palm against hers. When I finally came back to the house at dawn and found your letter, I felt like the ground had opened beneath me, Alexander said. Not because I was losing Pip's guardian. Not because my redemption plan had failed. But because I was losing you. The woman who makes me laugh. The woman who sees the man beneath the title. The woman I want to wake up next to for the rest of my life. You can't know that, Clara said, but her voice wavered. It's only been a few months. I know that Pip isn't Ash, Alexander interrupted firmly. He's his own dog, with his own personality, his own quirks. I love him for himself, not as a replacement. And I know that you aren't a symbol of redemption or a way to fix the past. You're Clara. Brave, kind, genuine Clara. And I love you for yourself, not for what you represent. He cupped her face with his free hand, his thumb brushing away tears she hadn't realized she was shedding. Yes, Pip brought you into my life, he said softly. Yes, my guilt over Ash made me desperate to protect him. But somewhere between Harrington Hall and here, between that first dinner and this morning, I stopped seeing you as necessary and started seeing you as essential. Not to the dog, to me. Alexander, I love you, he said fiercely. I love how you named this dignified, legendary bloodline dog Pip, and somehow made it perfect. I love how you hide biscuits in your pocket for him, even though Mrs. Daventry feeds him like royalty. I love how you read to him before bed and tell him he's a good boy, even when he's stolen my correspondence for the third time that week. I love your kindness and your strength and the way you've survived cruelty without becoming cruel yourself. Pip squirmed between them and licked both their faces impartially, as if to say he approved of this entire speech. I love you too, Clara whispered, the truth of it overwhelming. I have for so long, but I was so afraid. I know. So was I. Alexander's smile was radiant, despite his tears. But Pip taught us both something important last night. Love isn't about perfection or redemption or fixing the past. It's about showing up. It's about staying, even in the dark, even when it's hard. It's about choosing each other, every day, despite our fears. He set Pip gently on the ground, then pulled Clara into his arms properly, holding her as if she were infinitely precious. Come home, he murmured against her hair. Come home and marry me, and let's build a life together. You, me, and our ridiculously perfect dog who somehow managed to save us both. Clara pulled back just enough to see his face. What about Genevieve? I sent her away this morning with explicit instructions never to return. Alexander's expression hardened briefly. She was never a friend, Clara. Just someone who enjoyed having access to a duke. She certainly never understood what Ash meant to me, or what you and Pip have come to mean. She said you shut everyone out after Ash died. I did. But you opened me back up. He kissed her forehead gently. You and this troublesome terrier who apparently has no respect for emotional boundaries or morning sleep schedules. Pip, hearing his cue, barked cheerfully and began running circles around them, tangling them in an imaginary leash. Clara laughed through her tears. He's ridiculous. He's perfect, Alexander corrected. And so are you. Say you'll come home. Say you'll marry me. Say you'll spend the rest of your life with a man who will probably always be a bit too formal and a dog who will definitely steal your breakfast given half a chance. Clara looked at him. Really looked at him. Not the Duke of Greymore, not the tormented boy who'd lost his dog, but Alexander. The man who read beside the fire each evening, who slipped Pip treats under the table, who had learned to smile again, to laugh again, to risk his heart again. The man who loved her. Yes, she said simply. Always yes. He kissed her then, properly, deeply, while the sun finally broke through the mist and bathed the moorland in golden light. And at their feet, Pip danced with pure joy, the little dog who had somehow managed to heal 2 broken hearts and bring them home to each other. The chapel at Graymore Hall was filled with autumn sunlight and the scent of roses. It was a small gathering. Alexander had insisted on intimacy over spectacle, but everyone who mattered was present. The Dowager Countess of Harwick sat in the front pew, dabbing at her eyes with a lace handkerchief. Lady Pemberton smiled warmly. Mrs. Daventry and the household staff filled the back rows, their faces alight with genuine joy. And at the altar, beside a spray of white flowers, sat Pip on a velvet cushion, wearing a small bow tie and looking absurdly pleased with himself. Clara stood in the vestibule, smoothing the silk of her wedding gown for the 100th time. It was ivory, with delicate lace sleeves, simple and elegant. And when she'd first seen herself in the mirror, she'd barely recognized the radiant woman staring back. "You look beautiful, miss," Ellen said, adjusting Clara's veil one final time. "His Grace won't be able to take his eyes off you." Clara smiled, though her hands trembled slightly. Not from doubt. She had none of that anymore, but from the overwhelming enormity of the moment. In a few minutes, she would become the Duchess of Graymore. The girl who had inherited only a puppy would gain a title, a fortune, a magnificent estate. But more than that, infinitely more than that, she would gain Alexander. The music began, and Clara walked down the aisle on legs that felt steady despite her racing heart, every eye turned to watch her. But she saw only Alexander. He stood at the altar in elegant black, his gray eyes fixed on her with such open love that it took her breath away. When she reached him, he took her hands and whispered, "You're the most beautiful thing I've ever seen." "You're biased," she whispered back. "Completely," he agreed, smiling. The ceremony was traditional and lovely. The vicar's words about love and commitment and partnership resonating in the sun-filled chapel when Alexander slipped the ring onto her finger, a band of gold set with sapphires the color of his eyes. Clara felt something settle deep in her chest, a sense of rightness, of home. "I now pronounce you husband and wife," the vicar declared. "Your Grace, you may kiss your bride." Alexander cupped her face gently and kissed her with such tenderness that Clara felt tears slip down her cheeks. The chapel erupted in applause, and Pip barked joyfully from his cushion, tail wagging so hard his entire body shook. The wedding breakfast was held in Graymore Hall's grand dining room, transformed with flowers and candles into something magical. Clara sat beside Alexander at the head table, his hand resting on hers, and tried to absorb the reality of her new life. The Dowager Countess rose to make a toast, her voice carrying across the room with aristocratic authority. "I have seen many marriages in my long life," she said. "Marriages of convenience, marriages of alliance, marriages of desperation. But rarely, very rarely, have I witnessed a marriage of genuine love and mutual regard, Your Graces. You have found something precious. Treasure it." As the guests raised their glasses, Clara caught sight of movement near the doorway. A footman was speaking quietly with Mrs. Daventry, and the housekeeper's expression had gone tight with displeasure. Alexander noticed too. He leaned close to Clara. "Stay here. I'll handle it." But Clara stood with him, her hand still in his. "We handle it together." They crossed the room to find the footman looking distinctly uncomfortable. "Your Grace, forgive the interruption. There's a visitor at the gate, demanding entry." I told her the estate was closed for a private celebration, but she insists. "Let me guess," Alexander said coldly. "Baroness Albright." The footman nodded miserably. Clara felt Alexander tense beside her, but she squeezed his hand. "Let her in." "Clara, let her in," Clara repeated, and this time her voice was steady. "She came all this way. The least we can do is give her a proper goodbye." 5 minutes later, Baroness Vivian Albright swept into the entrance hall, looking like a storm cloud in dark purple silk. She stopped short when she saw Clara in her wedding gown, Alexander at her side, their hands linked. "So it's done," Vivian said, her voice dripping venom. "The little mouse trapped herself a duke. How clever you've become, Clara." "I didn't trap anyone," Clara said quietly. "Alexander chose me, just as I chose him." "Chose you?" Vivian laughed, the same cruel sound that had echoed through Harrington Hall's library months ago. "He felt sorry for you. He pitied the pathetic girl with nothing but a mongrel dog. Don't delude yourself into thinking this is anything more than charity dressed up as romance." Clara felt the old pain try to rise up, the familiar whisper that she was worthless, unwanted, merely tolerated. But then Alexander's hand tightened on hers, and she looked at him, at the man who had risked his carefully guarded heart to love her. The man who had chased her through the dawn mist, tears on his face, begging her not to leave. And she realized Vivian's words had no power anymore. "You're wrong," Clara said, and her voice rang clear and strong. "Alexander doesn't pity me. He loves me. He chose me not because I came with a valuable dog, but because of who I am. Because I'm kind and brave and worthy of love." She stepped forward, meeting Vivian's gaze without flinching. "You spent 6 years trying to convince me I was nothing, that my only value was in staying quiet and invisible and grateful for scraps. And I believed you for a long time. I believed that inheriting only a puppy meant I was worth only that, a small, unremarkable creature nobody wanted." Pip chose that moment to trot into the entrance hall, apparently bored with the wedding breakfast and seeking adventure. He saw Clara and bounded over, tail wagging, placing his paws on her silk skirts. Clara scooped him up, holding him against her shoulder. "But this puppy, this supposedly worthless dog, gave me everything," she continued. "He gave me loyalty when I had nothing. He gave me comfort when I was alone. And he led me to a man who saw my value when I couldn't see it myself." "How touching," Vivian sneered. "A fairy tale ending for the unwanted daughter." "No," Alexander said, his voice like steel. "An earned ending for a woman of exceptional character. Clara's father was a fool, Lady Albright. He had a daughter of grace, intelligence, and genuine warmth, and he treated her like an inconvenience. You had a stepdaughter who could have been a companion, even a friend, and you chose cruelty instead." He moved to stand beside Clara, his arm around her waist. "But your cruelty gave me the greatest gift of my life," he continued. "You turned Clara out with nothing, and in doing so you sent her to me. You tried to humiliate her by laughing at her inheritance, and instead you gave her the key to a future beyond anything you could imagine. So thank you, Lady Albright. Thank you for being so thoroughly yourself that Clara had no choice but to leave. We're both better for it." Vivian's face had gone white. "You'll regret this, both of you. When society tires of your little romance, when the novelty of the poor relation wears off, Society adores Clara, Alexander interrupted. As do I. As does everyone in this house. The only person who seems unable to see her worth is you, and frankly, your opinion ceased to matter the moment you threw her out. He nodded to the footman. Please escort Lady Albright from the property. She is not welcome here, now or ever. Vivian opened her mouth, closed it, then turned on her heel and stalked toward the door. But at the threshold, she looked back at Clara one last time. You inherited only a dog, she hissed. Clara smiled, stroking Pip's soft fur. I inherited everything I needed. When Vivian was gone, Clara sagged slightly against Alexander. He held her close, pressing a kiss to her temple. You were magnificent, he murmured. I meant every word. Clara looked up at him, this man who had become her home. She tried to make me believe I was worthless. But you taught me differently. You and Pip both. The little terrier licked her chin enthusiastically, making her laugh. They returned to the wedding breakfast hand in hand, and Clara looked around the room at the faces of people who had become family. Mrs. Daventry, who had welcomed her with kindness. Ellen, who had dressed her like she mattered. The Dowager Countess, who had defended her in society. The household staff who treated her with genuine respect. And Alexander, who looked at her like she hung the moon. The girl who had inherited only a puppy had gained the world. That night, after the guests had departed and the household had settled into quiet, Clara and Alexander walked through the gardens with Pip trotting ahead of them. The autumn air was crisp and stars scattered across the sky like diamonds. Do you remember what you said to me in the carriage? Clara asked. That first day, when you laid out all the boundaries? That our relationship was purely professional, Alexander said, wincing. That I was providing resources so the dog received proper care. God, I was an idiot. You were scared, Clara corrected gently. But you learned to be brave. He stopped walking and pulled her into his arms. We both did. You especially. The woman who stood up to Vivian today, who spoke about her own worth with such certainty. She's extraordinary. She's me, Clara said wonderingly. Finally, truly me. Not the quiet, invisible girl trying to earn scraps of affection. Just me. And it's enough. It's everything, Alexander said fiercely. You're everything. Pip barked from somewhere in the garden, having discovered something fascinating in the shadows. Our ridiculous dog is going to get muddy, Clara observed. Our ridiculous, perfect, miracle dog, Alexander amended. He kissed her softly. Who brought me you? The best inheritance anyone could ask for. And there, in the gardens of Greymore Hall, under a sky full of stars, Clara finally understood what her father's will had really given her. Not a dog, not poverty or humiliation or rejection, but the exact catalyst she'd needed to find her way home. And there it is. Clara's full inheritance. The girl who was left with only a puppy gained everything she truly needed. Love, family, home, and most importantly, herself. If this story moved you, if you smiled when Pip brought them together, if you cried when Alexander finally opened his heart, if you cheered when Clara stood up to Vivian, then I'm begging you, don't just watch and leave. Hit that like button right now. Share this with someone who needs to hear that they're worthy of love, that their value isn't determined by what others think. Comment below and tell me, what would you do if you inherited only a puppy? Your engagement is what keeps this channel alive, what tells me these stories matter. And if you haven't subscribed yet, after spending nearly an hour with Clara and Alexander. What's holding you back? I have so many more stories waiting. Stories of women who were overlooked, underestimated, and undervalued, who found their strength and their happy endings. Don't miss them. Subscribe, hit that notification bell, and join thousands of others who believe in love, second chances, and the power of one small puppy to change everything. Thank you for being here. Until the next story, remember, you are worthy of your own happily ever after. At the end of this video, you'll see a suggestion for another powerful story from our channel. Click it and let yourself be surprised by even more unforgettable emotions with love. The Victorian Royal Stories team.